Good afternoon. Certainly my pleasure to address and maybe take the group in a little different direction that's been set already here this morning. When the conference was put together and the themes were advertised, it was no surprise to me when I looked at some of the areas under technical threats, cyber operations, strategy, tactics, and doctrine, clearly all at the forefront of discussion. The need for policy and really execution. But I was really enamored at the addition of information warfare and the weaponization of social media. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes outlining where the department is on the efforts of information warfare and draw on a little bit of experience having practiced that over the past 15 years or so, both at Central Command, Special Ops Command, and then earlier, as a young man, at a tour out with 7th Air Force in Korea. The idea of competition is pretty intriguing in this space because we tend to polarize ourselves between two opposite ends. And that really is a nation at peace or a nation at war. And as we've discussed today, and there's been much written about this competition space, this third state seems to be a little more enduring maybe than at times past. And what we mean is, I think we're slow as a nation and as a military to recognize the adversary's capability in these interwar periods and how they've leveraged cyber to advance their cause of influence and control. Where there are rules that are pretty clear in some other areas, the rules are pretty murky, especially to the military complex of operating in this space. Part of that is it's difficult to measure. We don't really know how to define the terms. And it certainly doesn't play to the military's warfighting complex and its ability for lethality and how it can deliver on the battlefield. In fact, in some cases, people view this space as almost unfair that an adversary would take us on in this asymmetric manner, when in fact, there's nothing unfair about it. It's a new way of warfare. And again, I think we've been very slow to recognize it. I'll also offer that I believe this space is the largest space or domain in our areas that we operate today. And I challenge people when they use terms like operations in the information environment to describe what's not in the information environment. Everything is in the information environment, and that environment is all around us. We've gone through a whole series of terms, and we can talk about that. I think all of us have been familiar with psychological operations. Eventually gave way to military information in support or military information support operations because PSYOPs became almost a pejorative term, difficult to understand, and certainly the fear of influencing a domestic audience. We also became a bit shy on the fact that the ambiguity of what the casualty radius of delivering some of these messages. With conventional munitions, we can normally scope exactly the area of impact. But the challenge of information, especially when we conduct these operations, where does it go? Who gets influenced? And even though we may have control mechanisms on that, we can't always guarantee a precise delivery. So I have come across a term that works for me, maybe not for others, but since the lexicon is dwindling, for the rest of this brief and in our Q&A, I'll refer to this as information warfare. And what that is the amalgamation of everything from the electromagnetic spectrum to military information support operations, all the aspects of cyber that we described, and deception as well. There are several others that I think play more minor roles, but that's predominantly what I'll be focused on today. So if you look at maybe the situation, any good military person would start off after the mission is to get into the or maybe really to start off with the situation, both enemy and friendly, and then move into the mission. We'll talk about the adversary. And we'll juxtapose that with what we're doing in this space. And I think those either listeners or those who have experience here may come to the same conclusion I have. That is, our adversary is really fine-tuning their operations that fit in this operations below the threshold of armed conflict arena, which we commonly refer to as the competition space. They take risk. They understand information operations well. They know what, for example, things like election influence, civil disruption, presence on social media, looking to influence predominantly the Western audience, to bend them to either positions of increasing ambiguity or decreasing ambiguity as they see fit, but predominantly to lessen our faith in our institutions and our government and our own military capabilities. They used to be adverse to making mistakes, meaning their risk calculation looked a lot like ours for a time. It's no longer the case. They make mistakes, they learn from them, and they move on. They also have invested quite a bit in professionalizing this, in the training, in the people dedicated to it, the tradecraft and art that's necessary to do this at scale and in a sophisticated, effective manner. I think you'll see where we're at in that capability. And finally, maybe the most important aspect is they do this in a timely manner. Influence operations work only if you're able to execute when the conversation is fresh and relevant, meaning speed is more important than perfection. Delivering in the course of the dialogue rather than far after is the preferred method. And they have an OODA loop that they've perfected, which they're relevant in that space while the conversation is unfolding. They found a way to increase speed and, in their world, effectiveness. Take a look at where we are. Very slow. It's an honest assessment. Very slow to the fight. Very slow to realize the fight is actually unfolding in front of us. We tend to think of this competition space either as not happening the way I believe it's happening, or it's just a precursor to something more grand, i.e. more lethal. When in fact, the adversary, I believe, has found a great home in this space and probably has very little desire to move out of it. Feast or famine is where we are. We have three lenses I'll talk about when it comes to things like authorities, process, and capabilities. We tend not to align those three rings together very well, if at all. And when we do, we never seem to get all three aligned at one time, which means it's difficult for us to execute. We have few believers in this space to begin with. We're confident in the kinetic aspects, but not so much in these less kinetic activities. Yet we're very clear to see it done to us. I don't know how many conversations I've had where seniors and peers would say, you know what, I don't know that we can do this and be effective, but while at the same time credit our adversaries for moving quickly and effectively in that same space. So we're slow. And lastly, I think we remain considerably risk adverse. We're very much afraid of spillage in this area and maybe some of that influence target to get outside of the areas that we are expecting could go, despite the fact that we put a lot of safeguards in the plan. So if you think about these two camps, the adversary's pace, speed, and professionalism compared to where we are today, there's quite a difference and a lot to catch up, certainly. Scorecard that I talked about in authorities. Here's my frank assessment on all three. I think administrations past and Congress have been really helpful in ensuring that we have the right authorities to operate in this space. 15 years ago, wasn't the case. Today, I believe we have adequate authorities. The threat is viewed as global. That's a good thing. It means that we can't look at influence operations geographically, meaning that we might want to influence an audience that is not in what we consider to be a traditional area of hostilities. We have things now that have finally recognized influence operations as traditional military activity. These are legal definitions and standards required for us to practice the tradecraft in areas, again, that don't look like traditional geographical boundaries. The idea of getting those authorities pushed down to lower levels for action, it's also present, which means that commanders at lower echelons can operate with speed in these areas and take advantage, everything from the tactical all the way up to the strategic levels. Transitioning to process for a bit, we need to do some reform. While we may have the authorities to act quickly, the permissions, the process to get good ideas, for example, from combatant commands through the system and approved for execution, remains slow. And there are some reforms in the Pentagon to take a look at that. But what we need to be careful of is dynamic of really stripping down these bold plans and leaving nothing but risk. I've often used an analogy. To me, it's like taking a grand plan for this information campaign, like a Christmas tree, strapping it on the top of a car and driving it across country. It looks quite different when it ends up on the other side. Nothing but sticks and twigs, and everything else has been removed. Our plans often look like that. As they move through the channels, we start stripping off those areas that we view risky, but that is where the reward is. Risk and reward go hand in hand. And if all you're left with at the end is risk, it's not a surprise that our processes don't actually see those bold initiatives through to the other side. And lastly, probably one of the more challenging areas comes in capabilities. We need a trained workforce in order to do this type of activity. It's not best left to amateurs. And unfortunately, we have retired a lot of the competencies that we've had in our military service that does this very work. We've seen them atrophy over time, and it takes time to build them. It also takes some technology. We have not invested in this space adequately to ensure that we have the most technological means to analyze our performance, to ensure that we understand our environmental conditions, and that we can project that message in a quick, reasonable way and collect on it after our, so to speak, shot or putting that information out in the environment. And lastly, when it comes to the standards, repeatability of teams, just like Cybercom has done the great roles in joint force provider and joint force trainer, setting standards, building teams, understanding what competency looks like, and then swapping these teams out so they're seamless to the individuals who actually get the benefit of those teams joining their units. We have no such apparatus on the information warfare side. That is long since gone. We need to make sure that we understand things like cultural anthropology, religious history, that we are fluent in the languages that we'll be involved in, because these things are not done in English. They are done in these host nation languages that we're trying to influence, with those messages, with those populations. So a lot of work to be done. We don't today have the capability, even if the process was fixed and the authorities remained in the good state that they're in, it's difficult to execute without the trained force to get there. So what are the solutions? I think some of these are fairly intuitive. We need to stop being so slow to the realization that the fight's on. It's not about to start, it's ongoing, and we're behind. And it has been going for some time. We need to think of these activities as fires, integrated in our combatant commands plans, our con plans and O plans, to make sure this isn't a specialty business that sits in a corner room only for the few with certain clearances to see, but they're integrated as fires under our J3s, basically operational command, like we would for any other fire that we would originate. Cross-boundary fires are possible with proper coordination. We just need to stop treating these things as one-offs. We need a clear strategy with a clear lexicon, and we need to start to settle on some words rather than every term that we use in the space quickly becomes soiled somehow, and we're scrambling in the search of a new word set. Most of the lexicon, I believe, of 10 or 15 years ago is still applicable today. And then finally, like I had mentioned, we need to ensure that we have a joint force provider and a joint force trainer to shepherd these activities, to standardize, and to ensure that we are building that force and delivering that force clearly in this time of need. And then lastly, as a freebie, there's always something else, or that's not all. And so my time at Central Command, I was asked by my commanding general at the time, General Mattis, if I would serve up my entire lesson learned on information warfare in 20 words or less. And he gave me a little bit of time to go out and do this. And so I think I've got it in 15 words and 5 maxims that I have used to govern the way I analyze plans, build plans or strategy, and evaluate them. And they've held true, and maybe there's more, and maybe some of these are open for critique, but I think largely they've been durable. And the first one is that as part of a solution set to operate in the space, we don't need to be unique, right? So I would say don't be unique. The idea of certain activities, again, not shared in the spaces where commanders get to see them, or overclassification has hurt us. This idea of specialty and really hiding some of this has made the problem even more complex, and leaders don't even understand what tools they have available to them. These things tend to expire on the shelf, and we need to stop doing business. We've got to normalize that space. The second one is early is late. One of the activities or one of the features of this that makes it difficult for folks to trust is the fact that it must be seeded over time. If you're looking for a quick win, I don't know how many times there's been this rush to, at the point of execution, we're asked, can we sprinkle some information operations or information warfare on that plan? If you haven't seeded that, if you haven't worked that into the plan and made sure that is fully baked in and that the adversary has had a chance basically to see whatever those observables, to think, put it in their cognitive domain, then the likely expectation that they will act is almost zero. If you're looking to have people act based on your messaging in short time, we call that hypnotism, not influence. So we need to make sure that we're early and that we actually have a habit of putting these into practice. The third is these work best together. All the elements that we've described. Information warfare by itself without the kinetic piece and without some of these other parts, either as threats or in an active program, don't work well. It's also the other elements of power, whether it be other elements of information, diplomacy, economic, et cetera. It works when it's paired with other things rather than attempting to try them on their own. The fourth is you're not alone. Seldom can we operate in this space without some level of coordination. We have letter agencies that are active. That requires coordination. And a lot of this geography we're talking about, we have ambassadors that need to be brought into this, and station chiefs and others. And again, we've shown the ability to do this in the past, but we seldom do this by ourselves. And again, paired with other elements, it becomes more potent. And the last piece is we've got to do a lot better job of knowing the results. Measures of performance used to be our coin that we would use, and it's not hard to show, at least in past efforts, how busy we were. But we've never been really good at measuring our results, which means you have to have a collection plan in place to determine if what you're doing is working. It does require more patience. Some of those results may not be known for months, if not years. And again, if we're looking for quick wins in this space, it's unlikely that we'll see them. So lastly, what I'll leave you with is, sounds all doom and gloom. It's not. The old adage, the best time to maybe have corrected this or to be involved in the space was 20 years ago. The next best time, if we haven't done that, is today. What I've seen, at least in my experience recently, cyber has changed the game for us to look at information warfare simply because the digital arena has allowed us to deliver messages at speed where we haven't been able to before. It's allowed us to collect and look at impact like we haven't before. We consume our news, just like a lot of people do around the world, in a digital format, and in many cases through social media. So the battlefield and the environment has changed considerably. And that cyber as an enabler for many of these things has made this an attractive proposition. And there is great interest now, again, in Congress, in us making headway in this area, and certainly great interest in the department for us to pick our game up and be more involved and active in this space. I think we can return maybe to the day when we treated this with a little more deliberate effort, and certainly it's something we can't ignore. So with that, I'll give you something a little more to think about than maybe some of the traditional cybersecurity conversations we've had, but hopefully in the wheelhouse of what this conference is to allow. And I think on that note, we'll transition to some Q&A.
Thank you, General Crall, for your remarks and giving us military's perspective. It was very informative. This has been an incredible conference with the various participants we've had, national leadership, former congressmen. Later on, we've got the former Secretary of Homeland Security, and a number of us have been around this issue for a long time. What I hear you making an argument for is making it operational today and relevant to operational commanders. The way you framed it, I'm an old guy, been around a long time, so moving it from the classified world to a less classified world, so it's operational. That's what I could hear you making the case. Let me just ask as a starting point, where are we in that transition? Is this known understood and usable by the combatant commanders today?
So I would say that having talked to most of the combatant commanders, not all of them, but I think most of them on the subject, there is no need for selling or interest. They understand this space very well. And I think that they've been good advocates to see us move faster. The challenge that we have, though, is really in the capability side.
Mhm.
You think about how frustrating it is for a commander to say, you know what, I see it, I want to be more active. And when you pull that lanyard or you call for that support to start integrating it, you don't have the workforce that's on the other side that's trained, skilled, and ready to engage in that space. Uh, I think that really is the frustration here, is that if we're not careful, as this continues to attrit, one of the arguments that was made was, where would you find the home to professionalize this? For a joint force provider or a joint force trainer. There's been talk about putting this in various combatant commands to get this jump started. And the realization of having few things to put in those commands, really a sobering analysis.
Well, that you raised some very interesting points, and it gives me an opportunity to delve a little bit back in history and then to try to get a better appreciation for where this might go currently. First of all, across the nation, depending on which set of statistics you read, we're somewhere around 500,000 people short of the cybersecurity job openings that we have today. One writer said that 2 out of every 3 federal cybersecurity jobs is empty. Now, what I want to do is take a step back in history. I'm old enough to remember the Soviets, not the Russians, but the Soviets launching Sputnik.
Yep.
1957, the next year, the Congress passed, President signed National Security Student Loan Program, and it was run through the Department of Defense, and it sent tens of thousands of us to school, myself included. And 11 years later, we put a man on the moon, and we erased our concern about a missile gap. I have tried to argue that our level of threat today from cyber intrusion, cyber economic espionage, or potentially even sabotage is so great, we should consider a similar program. Now, you've made a very strong case, you need the talent. I'll get to where you train them or house them in the next question, but how do we get the talent? How do we fill that gap of 500,000? And let me put that question in context. I've been watching this for about 25 years. I really started to focus on the talent gap about probably 5 or 6 years ago. I was in the private sector, building a business, and I couldn't get the talent. So I started to pay attention. So when I started to pay attention closely, we were 300,000 short. Today, we're 500,000 short. And every time I've looked at those numbers, it's a bigger number, not a smaller number. So as a national leader, advisor to Secretary of Defense and so on, how would you recommend that the nation address this talent shortage?
So I think a couple things. So talking with cybersecurity broad, we're really at a crossroads to completely revisit the way that we are thinking about recruiting, training, and retaining. So I'll get to that. First off is we need to really understand our market. We use a lot of anecdotal evidence. I met young people, I talk to people, this is what they're asking for. We have not studied this. In any other environment, we would understand exactly what motivates people and to tap into that, where they're building the talent, what are the most useful attractants to get them in the job. And I'll tell you that in my own anecdotal experience, and recently, last week, I had an opportunity to attend a trip with the vice chairman out to some top 50 companies in the US, large tech companies. And what the CEOs and CIOs shared with me really resonated. And a couple lessons learned from them, having studied their market analysis, was we need to think differently, as they have. One is going into almost a human supply chain, is partnering with the universities and influencing them in a positive way for the curricula they teach, so that people coming out of those schools are clearly matched and proficient to do the type of work that we're talking about. That type of relationship, rather than just canvassing the schools and trying to pick the best based on how those classes work, but invest in the schools. We have a lot of young people today that have a very strong sense and desire to give back to the government. That's very much alive. So they have the will to do that. But then you look at the roadblocks. Student debt is a real thing. And they look at ways to, they've got to satisfy that. Our security clearances, how unenamored people are when they show up at our doorstep and say, I just can't wait to work here. And then a year later, they're out in the front office having not even come in the back because they're waiting. They're off to do something else. And the other piece that I think was fascinating is that I believe we need to stop thinking about the traditional work environment that we're trying to create. Some of these CEOs told me they have abandoned the idea of building core competencies geographically in areas because there are tax incentives, et cetera, because the people won't move there. So they're building those in Seattle, in Austin, Texas, in other parts of the country where this tech presence and the desirability to live is extremely high. And they've been able to farm some of that out. So I guess the question to fill that gap, what we need to do in the Department of Defense is, I'm not sure we need so many military billets. I think we need to take a look at what inherently has to be done under Title 10 and 50 for supervisory work and execution, how we can bring in more civilian talent, how many people would like to serve, but maybe they don't like some of the requirements to be in uniform. I look at the working hours of some of the people that are my most competent engineers and data scientists. They don't come to work like I do. They don't really enamor a 0-500 physical fitness regime and a formation. They like kind of the noonish hours and working till, midnight or 2 or 4 in the morning, and they're incredibly competent. So they don't have to look like me. We have to be able to leverage our National Guard, which shows a great prowess in this capability. And I think we can farm some of this talent out in the places that they are and maybe break down some of the hierarchies. So these teams become blended with military folks, civilian folks, academia, and research and others in these hybrid models. But I really do think that pairing this with the universities is really the first step in that, and extending things like internships where we can work security clearances early, and scholarships to address student debt are going to be required to break that logjam.
Well, you give me a great opportunity to advertise the organization I'm responsible for now. It goes by the shorthand Cyber Florida. Its official name is the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. But the way to understand that is we've been charged to increase the number of graduates in cybersecurity and increase the research and outreach across the state for 12 universities. Now, in the state, there are 500,000 students. In the 12 I just mentioned, there are 300,000, with a significant portion of them that are enrolled in technical and related fields. So if you're looking for a partner to have this discussion, yeah, you found your partner. Now, having done my shameless advertisement, let me go to the next question. I hear you. I agree with you. Where's the responsibility? Now, let me give you just a quick background. I had the opportunity to sit in the Director of National Intelligence seat for a couple of years at the end of the Bush administration. And the reason I took the job was we're failing in cybersecurity. I knew that from my NSA days. I went to the private sector. I built a practice in cybersecurity. It was doing well. And I was asked to take this job as Director of National Intelligence. I thought about it, should I do it, whatever. And finally, I got a call from the Vice President. He said, Mike, we need you. So, there was the answer. If President, Vice President ask, you're going to go do it if you're a person who's privileged to serve. So I did it. But my rationale was cybersecurity, because we're a nation at risk. Once in, and I made the arguments, and I could get the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, Secretary of State, Secretary Rice, and others, the National Security Advisor, and the President to listen. What I was pushing for was we have to take a bold step. And so I said to the Secretary of Defense, we need a cyber command. He said, Mike, why do we need it? And I said, well, Title 50, that's over on my side of the fence. Think of it as passive. We have collection capability. We have the ability to know, but we don't have the authority, unless there's special direction from the president, to do any destructive action. We need a Title 10 commander that can do this. And his answer was, okay, you've convinced me. Write me a letter. It took about 10 minutes to write that letter. Actually, one of my staff person, a woman named Melissa Hathaway, wrote it. I signed it. We sent it over. And he said, now we can cause some activity to happen in the Pentagon. And it took from October till June to actually make the decision. And then it was stood up. And the commander of Cyber Command initially was subordinated to Strategic Command in
That's
Omaha.
right.
But it was a dual hat. The talent base was in NSA. The Title 10 authority needed to be operationalized. So they decided to make it one person. And over time, it became a standalone specified unified command. There has been some concerted effort to acquire capability, buildings, machines, and staff. What I hear you saying is it's not adequate.
What I'm saying is that I think for sustainment is where you were going.
Mm.
If you look at the history of Cyber Command, first it was, do we have one?
Mhm.
And if you look at the commanders who have been there, the first commander was really ensuring that its mission and its policies were in place.
Sure.
Second commander that came along, it was really, for lack of a better way, butts and seats. Get the manpower in place to make sure that we have a capability. And now you look at the current commander that has now moved on to readiness and effectiveness and engagement, right? And the commander after that, as this thing continues to move, it's becoming more and more operational.
Mhm.
I look at the idea, all of that's good. But to your point, how many gaps do we have in the line? How do we sustain and how do we make sure that workforce and talent still comes into the program? I think that in order to close that gap, which appears to be at times increasing, to be honest, I don't have full command of the numbers over the past 5 years, but they clearly are not, the ranks are not filled. But in order to make sure that those numbers continue to trend in the positive direction, I think we have to take a look at what the work roles are required and go where the talent is. And again, from a military mindset, we have a very traditional way that we've done that.
Mhm.
We build organizations with a hierarchy, we put somebody on top, we wear uniforms, we do things in a certain way. But as the more I get exposed to how industry works and how they can make speed, they do very little of this. Good ideas, especially in this space, have to be very fluent from the bottom up and in the middle up. And we just have to make this type of work very attractive. So we've got to know our audience. We've got to know where they are. We've got to reach them. We've got to partner with the feeders who present these to us. We've got to make sure that when they're in, we can get them cleared properly. We've got to train them in the gaps that they have. We've got to accept the times when they go back out into the world because we've educated them to a point that they're now highly marketable, but the nation benefits from that.
Sure.
Right? How many people serve in the military and then get out and they're great citizens as a result of that? So we don't lose any of that talent in what we do. And we have to make sure that for those that we don't retain, we understand why. So I would argue that while we need to understand this better than superficially.
Mhm.
And you asked the question to start, who's responsible? The answer is yes. You'll find that in the intelligence side. You'll find that all throughout DoD. You've got certainly the Joint Staff has got a vested interest in this. We've now recently stood up a workforce division in the Joint Staff J6, pairing with the J1 that handles a lot of our people and resources. We've got the Chief Information Officer that's really pushing the cyber accepted service. I can find a positive and bright spot to almost every one of these organizations that realizes this and is now starting to pedal at a fairly high rate.
Mhm.
So I'm optimistic, but I just wonder if we don't need to take a look at that next bold step. I think our organizations are going to look decidedly different in the next several years, based on how we're finding talent and how those individuals desire to serve.
Well, I find your comments quite refreshing. I have a bit of guilty knowledge, having served on both sides of the fence. 30 years in the Navy, retiring as the director of NSA, then to the private sector. My business unit did cybersecurity. We also did support the intelligence community. And I will reinforce what you just said. Performing in support of an intelligence organization, doing mission, were contractor civilian employees, and they looked very different from their military counterparts, and they were very effective, some of the best in the world. So I find it very refreshing that you were describing what could be in the future. What I was attempting to do is to zero in as where might we continue that momentum? Should it be a program? Should it be a named official? Reason I'm focusing on this, I'm going back to the experience I had as a youngster, Sputnik, the National Defense Program, send kids to school on a scholarship or a loan, depending on which way it went. But you got a result out the end, and our number is huge. Is there appetite in the department, or should there be appetite somewhere else? Should there be legislation supported by the White House that causes an organization, it doesn't matter to me which one, but somebody to cause the outflow of skilled talent to fill the nation's needs? Do you think such a program would be needed?
I mean, I don't know if it's needed in that manner, to be fair. I do know that I don't have to work hard to find interest. This isn't like racing against the wind or running uphill. I think every organization, every entity, every leader that I've sat in front of understands the challenge. We may have differing views on maybe the best way, the more enduring way to go after it, but the environment is ripe. Congress wants to see us move. They've asked nothing but what can we do to help empower you to move faster and close that gap? I would say that certainly in the Joint Staff, within DOD, we're pushing against open doors. I believe it's going to be a combination hybrid manner that we're going to close these gaps. We're already at a high level of self-interest. I don't need any external motivation to try and close them. We know what we have to do. I just think that we're almost now in a campaign of learning that the environment, our product, so to speak, the best gift that we have, the most important aspect to this entire chain that we're describing are our people, is our talent. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it's our people as our greatest resource. And we need to find the way to bring them in and keep them.
The Marine Corps has probably one of the best reputations for taking talent and training it to be Marines, effective fighting force. We're talking about a different type of fighting force, and you've described it as hybrid, different, sometimes in, sometimes out, working odd hours, whatever, capturing the talent we need. And I don't disagree with that. But you did mention housing and training. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions on where that should happen?
Yeah, I've got a few, right? So I'll go back to the Marine example, which I think is an easy one for me. Having 7 years on recruiting duty, everybody who's a Marine will tell you they walked in on their own. Just had a bad day, maybe a good day, I'm not sure. And they decided they strolled in. That's furthest from the truth. We have an incredible recruiting effort. We've got a dedicated organization that does this. We heavily market. We're out in the areas. We know our audience extremely well. We've studied every aspect of attrition. We know what motivates people and what doesn't motivate people. And we have a brand name and image, and we seldom let you down. Well, the idea of we promise you hardship and you'll get it. We deliver. It's a tough service. But if I try and look at that dedicated effort and try and find that on the recruiting side, I see that in small pockets. There are some government entities that I think are remarkable examples of reaching out to people as early as high school, as developing internships, as paying them, getting their clearances put together. And by the time they come out the pipeline on the other end, they are ready, motivated, excited, and effective. And then there are others, but we just don't seem to have really a concerted effort in that sense.
One of my colleagues who is expert in human resources was asked by other unnamed services to study the Marine Corps to find out why are they so good. And one of the principal answers was you put line officers in recruiting duty that know the Corps and can sell the Corps and can understand. So clearly, Marines have the best organization.
But it's an effort. I guess that's my point.
That's
right?
the point.
It's not by chance.
Right.
And while it may need to be tweaked and we may need to continue to revisit it, it's a concerted effort. I don't think we've made that on the cyber side to any wholesale place. And the other piece you asked, where would this be?
Yeah, that was what I was.
And I'll tell you, it needs to be where the people are and where they want to be. I think the idea of distributed operations works very well in this space. I don't know that you have to assemble them all in one geographical location where they have to pick up and move and commit to an area, especially given the type of work that we do.
Let me try a trial balloon with you because I am frustrated by this. Now, first of all, as serving as the Director of National Intelligence, part of my role and mission is to protect sources and methods. That's made very clear. The current rules we have were established because in World War II, we were breaking, in cooperation with the Brits, Nazi Germany code, reading it before the German field commanders. In a similar effort between the Navy and the Army, Air Force didn't exist back that time, and I'm sure the Navy was, or the Marines were part of it. We were breaking Japanese code. It actually, breaking code allowed us to prevail with a suboptimal force at Midway that changed the whole course of the war in the Pacific. So the whole idea was protect source and method, because if the Germans knew or reading their communications, they just changed the rotors and would take it away from us. So a whole society grew up about security and secrecy and protecting sources of methods and so on. And we applied it in the Cold War and it served us well. Mm-hmm. I would argue we're in a new era. This is a difference. We are connected as a world. We have nation states with remote control access to the critical infrastructures of this country. We have a community, intelligence community, my old community, that produces very sensitive information and hoards it. I think it's time to make the argument we need to fundamentally change the classification rules. Mm-hmm. So if useful information is generated on a nation state who is going to secure some intellectual capital out of one of our major companies, we need to give it to them and give it to them as quickly as we can. Would you be supportive of that kind of initiative?
Yeah, I think again, you're talking about moving at speed. What are the requirements to move at the speed of relevance? If the traditional platforms are too slow to delivery, it's what I just described earlier in my remarks, then yes, we've got to be able to change. Again, the perfect understanding delivered too late. Everything, we could have an entire talk about our networks or cloud or autonomy, machine learning, AI. All of this is about making sense in that rapid, OODA loop in order to get a level of information dominance. This is what it's about. We're awash in a world of data, right? We can sense it and we want to act. It's the making sense piece. Again, if it moves too slowly. But, I would even ask you, in that same example that you used, what is more challenging? Access to a local energy sector and grid, or having an American population lose faith in their elections due to misinformation or disinformation? I think the adversary realizes you don't have to pick.
Right.
They want both.
Right.
And when we forego the impact of the psyche, I think that we're really shortchanging ourselves. And they have found this area of sowing dissent, a desire to strongly have us doubt our own democracy and our democratic ways of life and principle. And if you think about how the adversary is susceptible to things that could either cause them hesitation, again, ambiguity increasing or decreasing that could give you that advantage in a war footing, it's not as though they're immune to these things. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in societies that have closed information and managed information, some of their biggest threats is actually the provision of truthful information, which is a lot of what information operations really is about. Sure. It's about truthful information. So for all of the physical aspects that we focus on, I think that we need to take a hard look at the information space, because I believe it's as critical.
Well, I know in the course of the work we're doing here, our focus is the state university system, the K through 12 community and so on, but it does give us an opportunity for a voice at the national level, at least in the debate. And so in the course of the next months, years, we're going to make that argument. We're going to try to make it a dialogue at the national level, both the administration and the Congress, because that discussion needs to be conducted. Which brings me to a point I want to ask about. I took a turn at changing the clearance process in a previous life, a small amount of change. So I've looked at the numbers recently. For a youngster graduating from a university here in Florida, and they've got the right skills and they're hired into a place in the government, it's 12 to 18 months before they can start working. Now, we did the research and found that if you have any connection to the federal government, scholarship or any way of research project, you can start that clearance process while they're a junior.
That's right.
And so when they get to be a senior and they're ready to go to work, they go to work. So my colleagues and I went to previous administration, admittedly, but at the OSD level and said, we'd like to initiate this project as a pilot here in Florida to see if it works, because we think we satisfy the legal requirements. And the answer was, no, we're fine. We don't need, our statistics are better. So I said, okay, they have to report regularly. So I went back and checked the statistics. Still takes 12 to 18 months. So I'm hoping, because we're going to raise this again, we're going to keep banging on it until we can get someone to pay attention to us. I'm hoping you would be an advocate for us to say, let's take a serious look at this.
Yeah, there's no doubt that I'm in favor of, we're trying to strike that balance to ensure that we have rigorous screening, which is one of the reasons the process takes some time. But I do know the department has put a fair amount of money and effort into automating those pieces, and that they've improved those timelines. But I think there's a lot of work yet to be done. And I certainly would support doing that earlier to ensure that you are not compromising the proper vetting with the speed and the need to ensure these people are cleared. And I think if you look at a couple of the ROTC units across the country, they are starting to break the code on top secret clearance for students in those programs, and it's paying great dividends. So it can be done.
For the benefit of you and our audience, the banking system clears for what's roughly the equivalent of top secret in 10 working days. So it's doable. We just have to address it. Last question, and we'll wrap up. It's my favorite question because I think that's what's going to either propel us forward or cause us to have difficulty going forward, and that is authorities. You mentioned it in your remarks. You said we have adequate authorities. I know it's transition administration to administration, and the most previous one allowed us to engage forward short of armed conflict. And it also set up a situation where only Secretary of Defense has to approve an operation.
Yeah.
So that streamlined it. And from my point of view, protection of the 2018 elections and the 2020 election, that's a positive. However, adversaries have now knowledgeable of our law are using U.S. IP addresses to come inside the United States on a U.S. server to launch their attacks.
Which makes it difficult to reach.
Which makes it very difficult. So I would go back to the authorities issue and say, at least we need to have the debate. If the nation's best capability for detection of this sort of threat is the National Security Agency, and the National Security Agency is prohibited from looking internally, should that be reconsidered? So
I would offer that, I kind of look at it, my remarks when I made the comment on authorities is specifically related to information warfare. I certainly defer the broader cyber authorities to General Nakasone, who lives this every day. And his remarks, I think, are spot on really looking at the challenges he has to get after the adversary as far upstream as he needs to. So I certainly support, his vantage point and his knowledge in that space. I will say, as it relates to the authorities for information warfare, influencing and messaging, and the safeguards that Congress put upon us, I think we're in a good space. And my only point for offering that would be, we need to do so much on our side of the house first to test those limits, and then to come back. That, to me, I would not start with the information warfare authorities. I would start with our capabilities. Get our capabilities set, and then lay into that as a mission set and test those authorities to see if they're adequate.
Well, General Crall, thank you for your time, your insight, your support to the nation, and your dedication. We really appreciate it. We are privileged to have you appear here. We know that Tampa is one of your favorite areas, and we look forward to having you here as frequently and maybe permanently as you choose. So thank you very, very much. We
Thank you
appreciate
again
it.
for the opportunity.
Take care.